April 16, 1943, the wreckage of a twin-engine aircraft smoldered in a marsh near Saint-Valery-en-Caux, along the French coast. German patrols from the Luftnachrichten Regiment 211, the air warning unit guarding the radar chain between Dieppe and Fécamp, arrived first. The aircraft had come in low, perhaps 100 feet above the channel, and clipped a power line before plowing into the soft ground. The tail section bore faint white stars within blue circles, U.S. Army Air Force's insignia. Nearby lay fragments of an A-20 Havoc, its nose crushed, engines buried, and a single propeller bent clean backward. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, a 32-year-old signals officer, supervised the recovery. He expected radio equipment, standard Allied sets, frequency around 3 to 6 MHz, nothing new. Instead, his men uncovered a sealed aluminum container bolted beneath the fuselage. Stenciled in black, property of U.S. Army, experimental. The bolts were sheared off by impact, but the housing itself was intact. Inside, a compact cylinder wrapped in rubber insulation, wires leading to a glass dome. No labels. No dials. Just a faint smell of ozone and burned insulation. Brenner ordered photographs, then sent a runner to summon Hauptmann Erich Vogel, the local radar officer overseeing FUMG 401 Freya LZ, at Cap d'Ailly. Vogel arrived before noon, his Opel Kadett throwing mud along the field road. He examined the device silently, then spoke a single word, Nicht Deutsch. The Freya station's radar operators had reported unusual interference the previous night, a sudden spike of false echoes at 0217 hours, sweeping across their scope for nearly 90 seconds. At precisely the same moment, RAF Bomber Command launched Operation Ramrod 54, a daylight strike by 12 B-26 Marauders escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts against the Amiens rail junction. But the Freya's interference came from the northwest, too far north for that mission. Vogel's instinct told him the two were connected. He ordered the device transported under guard to Le Havre, where technicians from Luftnachrichtenabteilung 350 maintained the regional radar school. The crate left St. Valery by truck that evening, 1900 hours, labeled Captured Enemy Radio Device. By the next morning, April 17, it was on a workbench under floodlight. The Germans disassembled the outer shell carefully, noting English markings on several components. Westinghouse Radar Division, serial NO 2746. They recognized the name. Westinghouse had produced American aircraft radar since 1941. But this unit was smaller than anything known. The magnetron cavity, barely the size of a coffee cup, operated at 9.1 GHz, far beyond the range of any German system. When powered through a regulated supply, the dome pulsed faint blue light every 4 microseconds. Technicians mapped the waveform on an oscilloscope. Pulse width, 2.5 microseconds. Repetition frequency, 400 Hz. Effective power output, 10 kilowatts. This was not communications gear. It was an airborne radar, compact enough to fit inside a bomber's nose. Vogel drafted a report for Luftwaffe Signals Command in Paris, dated April 18, 1943, noting evidence of centimetric radiation, previously believed impractical for aircraft installation. He attached photographs, pulse diagrams, and a recommendation for immediate countermeasure study. Within 72 hours, the crate was sealed again, labeled Geheimhaltungsstoff I, nur für OKL. Top secret for the Luftwaffe High Command only. By then, British intercept units of Y service had already recorded the German signals chatter around St. Valery. When translated at Bletchley Park, analysts realized the Germans had recovered part of the Allies' most secret radar, the SR 720 prototype, the heart of the U.S. night fighter program. Back in France, Brenner watched the empty field where the wreck had burned out. He noted one last detail: the aircraft's flight plan recovered from a waterproof chart case. Route, RAF Ford Cherbourg Peninsula Calais return. Purpose, calibration flight, beacon test. He underlined the final words. Beacon test. He didn't yet know that this single find, an accidental crash of an American radar-equipped aircraft, would ignite a chain reaction of counter-innovation across Europe. Germany had stumbled upon the future of electronic warfare. April 20, 1943. Le Havre, France. Inside the requisitioned Hôtel de Ville, now the command post for Luftnachrichtenabteilung 350, 2 prisoners sat in separate rooms under the watch of Feldgendarmerie guards. Both wore flight suits, mud-stained and torn. Their dog tags read U.S. Army Air Forces. The crash outside St. Valery had not been entirely fatal. One man, First Lieutenant Robert Bob Cates, age 26, radar observer from the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, had been thrown clear when the A-20 struck the ground. Another, Sergeant Frank L. Dalton, the radio operator, had broken his leg. The pilot and gunner were killed instantly. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner entered the room with a clipboard and translator. He had no experience with aircrew interrogation, but his orders were explicit: obtain all information about the captured radar device. The room smelled of iodine and damp wool. Cates sat upright despite a shoulder wound. When Brenner asked, "What was your mission?" the American replied with the standard formula: name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. Brenner expected that. So he changed tactics. He unwrapped a cloth bundle and placed the captured device's glass dome on the table. The room fell silent. "This," Brenner said, "was found in your aircraft. What is its purpose?" Cates's eyes flicked toward it, just once, but it was enough. Brenner noted the reaction. He didn't press further. Instead, he ordered the dome removed and the prisoner returned to his cell. At 1600 hours that afternoon, a black opal-bearing Luftwaffe plates arrived from Paris, carrying Major Wilhelm Rosseler, a technical intelligence officer from Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL. Rosseler had previously studied captured British H-2S radar from a downed Sterling bomber in Rotterdam. He understood centimetric systems better than any man in France. Rosseler reviewed the wreckage photographs under a magnifier. "Not British," he said quietly. "American manufacture. Possibly their improvement on H-2S. If operational, it explains recent reports, Allied aircraft detecting our convoys even in cloud." He ordered Brenner to prepare the American officer for transfer to Fraynes prison, south of Paris, where the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center, Ossertestel West, could extract technical intelligence properly. April 23, 1943. Fraynes. Cates was escorted through stone corridors to an office lined with radio schematics. Waiting there was Oberstleutnant Erhard von Keller, Chief of Technical Interrogation. He had two goals: determine what wavelength the new American radar used, and whether it threatened the German night defense network built around Freya, Würzburg-Ries and Liechtenstein B/C sets. Von Keller began politely. Cigarettes, coffee, even an English-language newspaper. Then came the maps, cross-sections of radar installations from Normandy to Bremen. "Our Freya can see a bomber at 100 kilometers, Von Keller said evenly. "Our Würzburg gives us altitude within 200 meters. We defend the Reich at night with precision. Yet your aircraft came within 10 kilometers of our coastal chain undetected. Why?" Cates stared straight ahead. Silence. Von Keller slid across a photograph, the device's interior with a handwritten note reading 9.1 gigahertz. "Your people build equipment for this wavelength," he said. "We know because our detectors register nothing in that band. How do you generate such power from a device so small?" Still silence. The session ended after 2 hours. No confession. But Rosseler, watching through a glass partition, had already drawn his conclusion. The Americans were using cavity magnetrons, the same secret technology Britain had transferred under the Tizard mission in 1940. The implications were staggering. If the Allies could mount radar of such frequency inside a light bomber, then the Luftwaffe's radar chain was effectively obsolete. Centimetric waves passed unnoticed through the tuned receivers of Freya and Würzburg sets, rendering them blind to low-flying attackers. On April 25, Rosseler compiled his report. Recovered device is airborne centimetric radar, frequency approximately 9,100 megacycles, employing magnetron oscillator. Capable of detecting surface or aerial targets beyond optical range, irrespective of cloud or darkness. Immediate development of countermeasures required. His memo reached General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch by April 28. Within a week, Milch authorized the Corfu project, tasked with developing centimetric warning receivers. Meanwhile, in England, RAF intelligence monitored German radio traffic and noted unusual requests for magnetron data from Berlin. At Bletchley Park, analysts realized with alarm that the Germans were beginning to understand what they had found. The discovery at St. Valery was no longer an isolated event. It had become the opening move in a new invisible war, the electronic duel for Europe's skies. May 5, 1943. Berlin, Germany. In the marble corridors of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, a small group of officers gathered around a chalkboard covered with equations. At its center stood Dr. Ernst Heller, chief engineer at Telefunken's Radar Research Division, flanked by Major Wilhelm Rosseler, newly returned from France. On the board, Heller had written, lambda equals 3.3 centimeters, F is almost equal to 9.1 gigahertz. This, he said, tapping the number with his chalk, is the wavelength of the American device recovered near St. Valery. None of our receivers are tuned below 50 centimeters. Their system exists in a spectrum we cannot see. The room fell silent. Around the table sat engineers from Telefunken, Siemens and Lorenz, alongside representatives of the Luftnachrichten Inspection, Air Signals Inspectorate. The conclusion was immediate. The German early warning grid, Kamhuber line, was blind to centimetric radar. Rossler laid out his field report. The device, he explained, had pulsed energy at 9.1 GHz with 10 kilowatts peak output. Range perhaps 4 to 5 miles. Enough to detect a ship, a U-boat periscope or a coastline in darkness. The Allies were using radar not just for defense, but for attack, navigation and precision bombing. Within days, General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch issued Directive 19843, authorizing the Corfu program, a crash effort to build centimetric detectors capable of locating Allied radar emissions. June 2, 1943. Telefunken Research Labs, Berlin-Charlottenburg. On a workbench sat a prototype receiver, a simple horn antenna feeding into a crystal diode and oscilloscope. They called it FUMB7 Naxos. Designed to sweep between 8.5 and 10 GHz, its purpose was not to jam but to warn, detect Allied centimetric radar before it detected them. The first field tests began on June 10 at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's experimental airfield north of Berlin. Mounted in a Junkers Ju-88 C-6 night fighter, the Naxos receiver gave faint but distinct signals when illuminated by a ground-based magnetron transmitter borrowed from captured H-2S sets. Range 25 kilometers. Directional accuracy, within plus or minus 10 degrees. It was crude but functional. Still, engineers faced a deeper problem. While Naxos could sense the radar's emissions, it could not jam them. The magnetron's power and frequency stability made conventional interference impossible. German transmitters operating in the 50 cm or 2 m band simply could not project energy at such short wavelengths. In essence, the Allies had moved the war into a realm of physics where German doctrine could not follow. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, analysts decrypted a Luftwaffe Enigma message dated June 12, 1943. Corfu test at Rechlin indicates success. Counter-radiation receiver effective at 9 GHz. Further deployment recommended for NACJAG units. Within hours, copies reached the Air Ministry and Radar Research and Development Establishment, RRD, at Malvern. The British response was swift. They altered the modulation codes of H-2S radars, introducing frequency agility, rapid microsecond shifts between slightly different frequencies, to confuse any narrowband detectors. Innovation triggered innovation. July 4, 1943. Peenemünde West. A Ju-88, tail number 4R+UR, fitted with the Naxos prototype, took off at 0100 hours to intercept a formation of RAF Mosquito BMK.IVs crossing the Baltic coast. For the first time, a German aircraft homed on the radiation of an Allied radar rather than on visual sightings or ground control vectors. The Naxos operator reported faint pulses bearing 220 degrees. They followed for 20 minutes but never closed the gap. The Mosquito's speed exceeded 350 miles per hour. Still, the test proved the concept worked. Rossler recorded the results in his log. Electronic pursuit feasible. Requires greater sensitivity and directional control. By August, the RLM authorized production of 100 Naxos sets for deployment with NAC-Jagdgeschwader 300, Germany's radar-hunting night fighters. But while Germany raced to adapt, the Allies had already leapt further ahead. August 15, 1943. RAF Benson, Oxfordshire. At a briefing room lined with maps, Wing Commander Edward Addison addressed a group of American and British radar officers. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to a photograph of the St. Valery crash site, "the Germans now know about centimetric radar. We must assume Naxos-type receivers will appear in their night fighters within weeks. From now on, all H-2S and SCR-720 equipped aircraft will operate under window cover. Window, thin strips of aluminum foil cut to 27 centimeters, half the wavelength of German radar, would flood enemy scopes with false echoes." The irony was clear. While the Germans struggled to see the invisible American wavelength, the Allies would soon blind them with reflections from ordinary metal foil. By the end of August 1943, the race had crystallized. Germany, rushing to detect centimetric emissions. Allies, shifting frequencies, introducing countermeasures. The battlefield, the electromagnetic spectrum itself. The discovery at St. Valery had evolved into a continent-wide duel, a war fought not by bullets, but by oscillators, waveguides and vacuum tubes. September 22, 1943. Bremen, Germany. 23:47 hours. The night was overcast, visibility near zero. Above the cloud deck, Lancaster bombers of RAF No. 57 Squadron leveled off at 19,000 feet. Each carried a single 4,000-pound cookie blast bomb and 14 500-pound incendiaries. Their path, west to east across the Weser River, target, the Focke-Wulf Aircraft Works at Bremen. Every aircraft in the formation carried the new H-2S Mk.3 radar, operating at 9.1 GHz. Its cathode ray scope painted the coastline and river like a glowing map. The radar operators could see Bremen's docks as bright returns even through heavy cloud. At 23:49, the lead navigator called over the intercom. Target confirmed. Turning to heading 082. Bomb run begins now. Below, the German night defense network, the Kammhuber line, scrambled into action. Searchlights probed empty sky, blind in the overcast. Radar plots flickered. Freya stations at Nienburg and Oldenburg tracked the incoming stream until it disappeared beneath the interference of window, millions of aluminum strips dumped by the bombers at precisely timed intervals. The Würzburg Reese sets could see hundreds of echoes, none real. Controllers cursed as the scope bloomed white. But it stayed, 40 kilometers west of Hamburg, a Ju-88 G1 of Nachtjagerschwader 300, flown by Hauptmann Victor Mertens, carried one of the first operational FUMB-7 Naxos receivers. His operator, Unteroffizier Heinz Lauter, watched a green trace flicker on his oscilloscope. The signal pulsed, steady, rhythmic. Contact. Centimeter band, bearing 090. Mertens banked east, throttled up to 1,350 revolutions per minute, climbing to 17,000 feet. For the first time, a German night fighter was homing on the emission of Allied radar instead of being guided by ground control. At 23:58, over the Weser, the Lancaster formation opened bomb doors. Their pathfinders, Mosquito BMK.XVIs, had already marked the target with red flares through gaps in the cloud. Explosions began to walk across the Focke-Wulf plant. From 60 kilometers away, Mertens' Naxos still registered the pulsing of H-2S sets. As he closed to within 15 kilometers, the trace grew stronger. The scope peaked, then dropped, meaning the source had passed overhead. He throttled back, turned to intercept the returning stream. At 011, his radar operator caught a second spike, bearing 270 degrees, range less than 5 kilometers. Mertens glimpsed silhouettes against the dim light of fires below. Twin tails. Lancaster. He closed to 200 meters, aimed the upward-firing Schrage Music cannons, and fired a 3-second burst. The Lancaster disintegrated in a silent flash, falling through the clouds in flames. It was the first confirmed kill guided by centimetric radiation. News reached Berlin 2 days later. Rossler added the engagement report to his growing file of Naxos successes. The OKL circulated it under the title Erste Gefechtsauswertung, Corfu. But buried in the after-action data was a disturbing detail. The Naxos set had failed to register half of the returning bombers. Engineers discovered why. The Allies had introduced frequency hopping modulation into H-2S radars. Each pulse shifted slightly in frequency, by 50 to 80 MHz, faster than the Naxos could track. The electronic advantage had lasted only weeks. October 4, 1943. Malvern, England. Inside the Radar Research and Development Establishment, British scientists analyzed intercepted German reports of Corfu equipment. In response, they launched Project Mandrel. Mandrel transmitters aboard RAF bombers emitted broadband noise between 2.5 and 3 GHz, jamming Freya and Würzburg radar sets. The plan? Saturate the German early warning system before each major raid. By October 10, Mandrel was operational. 30 B-17s of the U.S. 8th Air Force carried prototype jammers during daylight strikes against Munster. German controllers, confused by sudden static bursts across their scopes, reported complete blackout of radar chain for duration 38 minutes. The electromagnetic battlefield was now contested on every wavelength from 50 centimeters to 3 centimeters. October 17, 1943. Bremen again. The city's defenses, reconfigured with Naxos-equipped night fighters and experimental Corfu B receivers, awaited another assault. Yet when the bombers came, they flew under Mandrel cover. Every radar screen from Wilhelmshaven to Hanover filled with snow. The night sky remained invisible. Hauptmann Mertens and his Ju-88G circled for 2 hours, Naxos silent, unable to find a single target. When dawn broke, the fires of Bremen burned again. The Germans had found their countermeasure, only to discover the Allies had already countered the countermeasure. The war in the ether was accelerating beyond command orders or strategic planning. Each side was now innovating on a weekly cycle. And for the men like Brenner and Rossler, engineers turned soldiers, it was clear, victory would go not to the side with the most aircraft, but to the side that could think faster. November 6, 1943. Telefunken Research Laboratory, Berlin-Charlottenburg. Rain tapped against the windows as Dr. Ernst Heller examined an oscilloscope trace. The line pulsed with faint irregularities, static, hiss, then nothing. On the bench before him sat a FUMB-7 Naxos receiver, its casing open, tubes glowing weakly. For the past month, Heller's team had recorded baffling results. Allied radar emissions were no longer stable. Where once the 9.1 GHz signals pulsed cleanly, they now drifted erratically, faster than any mechanical tuner could follow. Frequency agility, Heller concluded. They are changing frequencies between pulses. Rossler, standing nearby, frowned. Then Naxos is blind? Not blind, Heller replied. Deafened. The noise we hear is their silence. He meant it literally. Allied radars were learning to hide inside the electromagnetic spectrum itself. November 10, 1943. Peenemünde West. An experimental Ju-88G1 climbed through low fog, carrying the first prototype of Corfu Beta, an advanced receiver with automatic tuning circuitry. The goal? Follow the Allies' wandering frequencies by scanning a 500 MHz range in microseconds. Test results were mixed. The system could detect strong radar emissions within 10 kilometers, but its servo-driven tuner lagged behind rapid shifts. In real combat it would fail. Still, Rossler pressed on. We cannot stop the Allies from transmitting, he told his staff, but we can make them hesitate to use their devices. He proposed an audacious plan, Operation Stillefeld, Silent Field. The idea: flood key sectors of the western radar chain with artificial background noise, forcing Allied crews to doubt their readings. If bombers saw false coastlines or phantom ships, they would misjudge navigation and scatter. To accomplish it, Germany would deploy noise transmitters, low-power jammers, along the Channel coast, synchronized to mimic radar reflections. It was deception by distortion. December 2, 1943. Boulogne-sur-Mer. A column of trucks from Luftnachrichten Regiment 211 arrived carrying sealed crates marked Korfgerat, Stillefeld 3. Inside each, a 2.5-meter parabolic dish, tuned amplifiers and diesel generators. Within 48 hours, the crews had erected 10 transmitter sites between Calais and Dunkirk. Each emitted bursts across 9.0 to 9.5 GHz, modulated with pseudo-random patterns recorded from Allied radar echoes. When tested, British radar at Dover picked up shimmering ghost images, coastlines drifting, harbors appearing where none existed. The illusion lasted minutes, then faded. The Allies suspected weather interference, unaware that German transmitters were deliberately warping the electromagnetic landscape. Rossler's experiment had succeeded, the first deliberate electronic camouflage. But success was short-lived. December 14, 1943. RAF Coastal Command, Northwood. Operators monitoring radar anomalies off the French coast noticed repeating signatures, identical patterns appearing at fixed intervals. The deception was too regular. By correlating multiple radar stations, they triangulated the false signal's origins to Boulogne. 2 days later, Mosquito FB.VI aircraft from No. 613 Squadron struck the transmitters with rockets. The sites burned for hours, their dishes twisted beyond repair. The silent field was gone. At Telefunken, Rossler received the report in silence. His plan had been elegant, but predictable. The Allies had learned to read the pattern of German interference as easily as a fingerprint. January 3, 1944. Bletchley Park. Decrypted Enigma messages confirmed German efforts to build active deception transmitters. The Air Ministry's countermeasure was immediate, a new radar coding protocol named Blue Yeoman. Instead of fixed pulses, Blue Yeoman transmitted phase-shifted bursts carrying encrypted identifiers. Allied crews could now distinguish genuine returns from decoys by matching signal phase sequences. Mathematics as defense. The result: total immunity to Stillefeld deception. Back in Berlin, Heller presented his final memorandum to the RLM. The enemy adapts faster than we can build. They are turning silence into strategy. Their equipment no longer merely detects, it thinks. Rossler signed the report without comment. 4 months, he had fought to keep pace with unseen opponents across the channel. Scientists with better resources, faster communication, and unbroken supply chains. Germany was still innovating, but always one step behind. He closed the file marked Corfu and stamped it abgeschlossen. Completed. But even as he did, the war for silence was only shifting fronts. In England, radar engineers were already designing something entirely new, a device to hunt the hunters, a system that would locate German Naxos receivers by the faint emissions of their own oscillators. For every secret the Germans unearthed, the Allies built another shadow to cover it. The age of radar had begun with discovery. Now it was becoming a war of ghosts, signals chasing signals, each seeking silence in the noise. February 11, 1944. RAF Coltishall, Norfolk. A new aircraft stood on the tarmac beneath the floodlights. De Havilland Mosquito and FMK.19, its nose packed with electronics. Painted matte black, it bore no squadron code, just a small stencil reading Project Serrate. Inside, RAF radar engineer Flight Lieutenant Charles Bowen performed final checks on a new receiver slotted beneath the cockpit, the Serrate 4. The device had one purpose: to detect emissions from German Liechtenstein and Naxos radar sets. 4 months, Allied intelligence had recorded the faint oscillations of German receivers. Even when Naxos was passive, its local oscillator leaked microscopic signals into the ether. With sensitive antennas, those emissions could be tracked. The hunters of the night, the Ju-88s, were about to become the hunted. February 12, 1944. 1:37 hours. The Mosquito climbed through cloud to 18,000 feet, its twin Merlin 25 engines purring at 2,600 revolutions per minute. On Bowen's cathode ray display, a faint blip appeared, steady, pulsing at 87 MHz. Liechtenstein B/C radar. German night fighter. Pilot squadron leader DC Don McFadden eased the stick left. The signal grew stronger. At 1:48, they spotted the faint exhaust glow of a Ju-88 ahead. The German crew, focused on searching for bombers, never realized they were being stalked. McFadden closed to 200 yards and fired 4 20mm Hispano cannon. The Ju-88 exploded midair, the first kill achieved by tracking an enemy radar emission. Within days, RAF squadrons across England began receiving Serrate-equipped Mosquitoes. Meanwhile, in Lübeck, Major Wilhelm Rossler studied a report from Night Fighter Command detailing the loss of multiple Ju-88s in a single week. Crews had no warning. Some vanished without ever transmitting. He requested a technical analysis from Luftnachrichtenabteilung 1/9. Their finding was chilling. Enemy aircraft appear capable of homing on local oscillator radiation from Liechtenstein and Naxos sets. Recommend immediate redesign or shielding of intermediate frequency stages. In essence, Germany's most advanced radar receivers were betraying their position. Rossler underlined the phrase homing on oscillator leakage, and muttered, "They are hunting our hunters." March 3, 1944. Telefunken Factory, Berlin. Engineers scrambled to develop Naxos Z, a variant with shielded cavities and reduced leakage. But the design changes added weight and reduced sensitivity. Testing revealed another complication: shielding trapped heat, causing tube failure after only 20 minutes of operation. Production slowed to a crawl. At the same time, Allied signals intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe messages discussing Serrate Jagd, Serrate hunters. To counter, Rossler proposed Project Fliege, an attempt to use Naxos receivers to detect the Serrate signals themselves, essentially reflecting the shadow back onto the enemy. It was a feedback loop of detection, each side trying to hear the other's silence. March 22, 1944. Near Kassel, Germany. A night convoy of Ju-88GS took off to intercept returning RAF bombers. Unknown to them, 2 Mosquito and FMK.XIXs from No. 141 Squadron were already overhead. Serrate scopes lit with clean tones, the German Liechtenstein radars below. By dawn, for Ju-88s had failed to return. The Luftwaffe's Nachjagd arm reported heavy losses. Crews began turning off their radar during missions, relying instead on ground control and visual contact. But without radar they were blind. The technological pendulum had swung again. April 9, 1944. Bletchley Park. Intercepted Enigma decrypts confirmed that the Germans were ordering radar silence on all night fighters unless in direct contact with bombers. The Allies noted the irony. The Luftwaffe had built an empire of electronics. now forced into radio silence by fear of its own signals. British analysts labeled it the shadow effect, the paradox of detection. Every transmitter revealed itself by existing. Back in Germany, Rossler stared at a map marked with red pins, each representing a lost night fighter. He summarized the new reality in a memo to General Feldmarschall Milch, dated April 10, 1944. The enemy has turned our strength into a weakness. Each emission is a beacon. To survive, we must become silent. From that moment, the term, emissions discipline, entered Luftwaffe doctrine. Emission discipline, strict control over radar use. But the silence came too late. The Allied radar net was now dominant. Serrate for hunting, Monica for warning, H2S for navigation, window for deception. The Germans still possessed brilliant engineers, but no longer the initiative. That spring, as the skies filled nightly with bombers and countermeasures, one truth had become clear. Technology could no longer be separated from survival. And for Rossler and Brenner, who had once unearthed the strange American device in a French field, the shadow they had released was now consuming their own air force. May 30, 1944. Saint-Dizier Airfield, France. A thin dawn mist hung over the concrete runways. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, once the signals officer who'd uncovered the American device at St. Valery, now stood among the remnants of a shattered command. His unit, Luftnachrichten Regiment 211, had been redeployed to assist the Nakjag defense along the Western Front. The war had changed shape. The Allies were coming. Each night brought the roar of bombers overhead, hundreds of them invisible above the clouds, guided by radar images as sharp as daylight. Brenner's crews manned their Freya and Würzburg stations as before, but they knew it was futile. The scopes filled with static and false echoes, window, mandrel noise, countermeasures of every kind. What had once been the razor edge of German air defense was now a snowstorm of light. At 2:10 that morning, Brenner's operator shouted, "Unidentified echoes, hundreds, bearing 310. He leaned in. The screen showed a solid wall of returns sweeping south. It was the RAF bomber stream, 200 aircraft crossing the coast in formation. Brenner switched to backup frequency. No clarity. No picture. The Kammhuber line, the radar shield that had once stretched from Denmark to the Bay of Biscay, was blind. June 6, 1944. Normandy coast. At 3 o'clock hours, German radar stations reported faint contacts off the Calvados coast. Commanders dismissed them as another deception raid, more phantom echoes, like those the Allies had created with Operation Glimmer, where small boats dropped radar-reflective chaff to simulate an invasion fleet near Boulogne. But these echoes were real. At 5:30, Allied landing craft struck the beaches of Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. For the first time since 1940, the Germans had been caught off guard, not by the enemy's strength but by their own blindness. The radar network, saturated by countermeasures, had failed to distinguish reality from illusion. That evening, as reports flooded in, Rossler received an urgent call from the Luftwaffe operations staff in Paris. They wanted immediate evaluation. Why had radar coverage failed? He answered truthfully. Because the enemy controls the spectrum. He explained that mandrel jammers deployed on B-17s orbiting the channel had reduced the detection range of Freya stations to less than 15 kilometers. Simultaneously, Window had filled Würzburg displays with false convoys. Even the short-range Corfu detectors were overwhelmed by overlapping radar signals from hundreds of Allied ships. Germany's eyes had been put out by mathematics. June 8, 1944. Le Havre. Brenner walked through the wrecked control center of his old post. The same airfield where he had once examined the strange American device now lay under bombardment. Files burned in metal cabinets. Radios crackled uselessly. On one surviving desk lay a copy of his original report from April 18, 1943, stamped Geheimhaltung Stuff I. He stared at the date. 13 months earlier, that discovery had seemed a triumph of intelligence, a captured miracle. Now it was a prophecy. He folded the paper into his coat pocket and stepped outside as Allied fighter bombers swept low, strafing the roads with .50 caliber fire. The war had turned on its axis, and every invention since that spring day in St. Valery had led to this moment, the night Germany lost the sky without knowing it. June 15, 1944. Berlin. In a reinforced conference room beneath the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Rossler presented his final analysis to what remained of the Luftwaffe High Command. His tone was clinical. Our detection network is obsolete against centimetric radar. Countermeasures require months we do not possess. The enemy can navigate, attack and jam at will. The electromagnetic domain is lost. One general asked if the Allies could be blinded in return. Rossler shook his head. They adapt faster than we can prototype. Every frequency we reach they have already left. The meeting ended in silence. June 22, 1944. Normandy. On a ruined French farm north of Caen, an Allied radar technician from the U.S. 9th Tactical Air Command set up an N/TPQ-3 radar unit to track German artillery. The device was smaller than a truck, accurate to within 30 meters. It represented the next generation, the fusion of radar and targeting into a single battlefield brain. The Germans never saw it coming. By midsummer, the electromagnetic war that had begun with one crashed A-20 in a French field had evolved into total Allied dominance. Radar now guided ships, bombers, artillery and fighters. The Luftwaffe's countermeasures, brilliant but reactive, had collapsed under the speed of innovation. For Brenner and Rossler, the sky they once sought to control had become a mirror, reflecting every signal they tried to hide. The turning sky belonged to the side that no longer needed to see to strike. July 20, 1944. Berlin. Inside the gray walls of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Dr. Heinrich Rossler sat at his desk, reviewing the last intercept reports from Western France. The headings were uniform, same format, same handwriting, same futility. Signal strength, nil. Range nil. Jamming, constant. The electromagnetic spectrum, once the Reich's secret weapon, had become its cage. Where the Allies adapted in weeks, German industry took months. Vacuum tubes burned out faster than they could be replaced. Copper wire was rationed. The factories at Dessau and Friedrichshafen were under constant bombardment. The advantage was gone. At 11 o'clock hours, a coded memo arrived from Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. Cease all attempts to rebuild radar installations west of the Seine. Focus on tactical relocation to the Reich interior. Translation: abandon France. Rossler read it twice, folded it once and placed it in his briefcase. The war of signals was over. The war of survival had begun. August 7, 1944. Mortagne, France. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner rode in the back of a command half-track belonging to Panzer Lehr Division. The counterattack at Mortagne was already collapsing under Allied air strikes guided by radar-controlled 9th Air Force squadrons. From 6,000 feet, P-47 Thunderbolts dropped ordnance with mathematical precision. Each attack vector called in by ground radar teams using SER 584 mobile sets. The irony was not lost on Brenner. He had once studied such frequencies, diagrammed their emissions, built countermeasures. Now those same frequencies hunted him. By 1400 hours, the road was impassable, columns burning, the sky filled with vapor trails and smoke. The Luftwaffe could not intervene. Their airfields were wrecked. Their fuel reserves were gone. The Reich's doctrine, precision through order, dominance through control, was powerless against the Allies' chaos of innovation. August 15, 1944. Allied forward radar post near Argenton. On a cleared patch of farmland stood an American SER 584 radar, its parabolic dish rotating in mechanical rhythm. Inside the truck, Technical Sergeant Thomas McCready monitored the screen. He was 24, a physics graduate from Michigan, now serving as part of the Radar Intelligence Detachment advancing with the U.S. First Army. That morning they detected faint blips, 2 enemy aircraft at 3,000 meters moving east. McCready adjusted gain, logged the bearings and relayed to HQ. Minutes later, a pair of P-61 Black Widow night fighters intercepted and destroyed both targets. He noted the results and added a remark. Radar efficiency confirmed. No interference observed. The Allied system worked, redundant, mobile, adaptive. It had become invisible infrastructure, woven into every operation. September 2, 1944. Stuttgart, Germany. In a dim workshop beneath the ruins of the Telefunken research facility, Rossler assembled the remains of a FUG 240 Berlin radar set. It was a copy of the British H-2S system, reverse-engineered from a down Lancaster in 1943. He knew it worked, on paper. But the oscillators could not hold frequency under sustained heat. Every test failed within hours. The engineers were exhausted. He dismissed them and sat alone, listening to the hum of the generator. In 1 year Germany had fallen from spectral dominance to near blindness. The war's outcome was now mathematical certainty. April 1945. Bavaria. Brenner, reduced to a captain without a command, surrendered to an American patrol near Bad Tolls. The Americans catalogued his papers, technical drawings, radar schematics, notes in precise handwriting. Among them, one item caught the attention of an intelligence officer from Ustaf, a tattered folder titled St. Valery Device, April 1943. The officer read, smiled faintly, and marked it for transfer to Operation Lusty, the Allied effort to capture German aeronautical research. Brenner said nothing. He simply asked, "Will it be studied?" The officer nodded. "It already has been." August 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. In a bright laboratory lined with radar consoles, Macready, now a civilian engineer, examined a German cavity magnetron extracted from the same file. The design intrigued him. Crude but clever. He penciled a note in the margin, "Potential for microwave communication." The cycle had turned again, enemy to prototype, weapon to tool. What had begun as secrecy had evolved into science. By war's end, the Allies' radar network spanned continents. Over 1,500 stations, 8,000 mobile sets, and 300,000 operators. The electromagnetic war had rewritten every doctrine of combat. Where the Germans built walls of steel, the Americans and British built webs of signal. One collapsed. The other endured. And somewhere, in the rubble of Europe, an engineer named Brenner understood what Rossler had once said in despair. The side that masters the invisible wins before the battle begins. That was the reckoning. Not a defeat of armies, but of imagination. The strange device found in a muddy French field had been more than American ingenuity. It had been a glimpse of the future.